Perfect. Thank you. And let me introduce our speakers for this afternoon, or for all of us, no matter what time zone, I think. All right. So first we have Kelly Rich is an assistant professor of English at Wellesley College and a Korean transnational adoptee. She is the author of States of Repair, The Promise of Welfare in the Post-War British and Anglophone Novel, and is currently at work on her second book project, Children of Conflict, Cultural Formations of Transnational Adoption. With Nicole Rizzuto and Susan Zeiger, she co-edited the MLA prize-winning collection, The Aesthetic Life of Infrastructure, Race, Effect, Environment. Her research has appeared in Representations, ELH, Modern Fiction Studies, Contemporary Literature, and Law, Culture, and the Humanities, and has been supported by AAUW, Wellesley College, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Marianne Novi is a professor emerita. Am I getting that correct?
Merida.
Obviously, I am not an academic. And professor of English and gender, sexuality, and women's studies at the University of Pittsburgh, and an adoptee who met her birth mother at age 32 and maintained the relationship. She co-founded the Alliance for the Study of Adoption and Culture, edited Imagining Adoption, Essays on Literature and Culture, and wrote Reading Adoption, Family and Difference in Fiction and Drama. This summer, Temple University Press published her book, Adoption Memoirs, Inside Stories. And Sarah Idzik is assistant professor of rhetoric at Carnegie Mellon University, where she researches rhetorics of transnational, transracial adoption as they intersect with race and empire, and teaches course on race and rhetoric, Asian American studies, and rhetorics of empire. All right, ladies, thank you so much for being here. You want to get started?
Yeah, so I think that we, in terms of an order, perhaps Marianne can go first, and then it doesn't matter to me, Sarah, if you or I go, so we can figure that out over chat while Marianne's talking. Okay. Thanks, Marianne.
Okay, thanks. One of the frequent narratives in adopting memoirs is a movement toward connections. I discovered this when researching my new book, Adoption Memoirs, Inside Stories. In this book, I discussed 12 memoirs by same-race adoptees and 10 memoirs and 2 memoir-like films by transracial adoptees, as well as 22 other memoirs by birth mothers and adoptive parents. Adoptees, more than those in the other groups, often early in their memoirs write about a sense of being disconnected, of not belonging. Especially if they are transracially adopted, they feel they don't know anyone who looks like them. Laura Jaquila, same-race white adoptee who doesn't know her ethnicity, writes, "Until I married and had children, I was single, solitary, someone who most days wanted to take up no space at all. When she was 7, she wanted her dog to become a person, to give her companionship, and failing that, had fantasies about a sister. She remembers this when she's having difficult email conversations with her sister by birth." Most published adoptee memoirs have as a major theme and plot the attempt of the memoirist to find and connect in some way with their birth parents. The relationship is not necessarily easy, and sometimes it is impossible, but attempts to develop it are a focus. Betty Jean Lifton finds a birth mother who will talk with her only on the phone. A.M. Holmes has a similar experience, and her birth father tries to talk to her only on the phone in his car. Jackie Kay finds a birth mother who has lost most of her memory and a father who is a fundamentalist and tries to exorcise her. Catherine McKinley discovers that her birth mother sometimes confuses her with the sister she gave the same name, and her father seems to be homophobic, though not as much as Kay's. Jean Strauss feels uncomfortable with her birth mother for a while because she misses her dead adoptive mother, but finding her birth mother's mother helps bring them all together. Nicole Chung senses a strong affinity with her Korean birth father. Laura Jaquila is pained when her difficult birth mother, who has only communicated via email, rejects her, but she still has some connections with her birth siblings. Soon after meeting his birth mother, for lunch, Jeremy Harding sums up what he has learned about her life and lets the reader assume that the relationship will continue, though he ends the memoir by speculating about the childhood of his dead adoptive mother. Usually, before they meet their birth parents, transracial adoptees move toward connections with other people of their race. Almost all transracial adoptees I have read live in all white communities as children, so it is difficult. Catherine McKinley, as a young adult, meets and becomes friends with other mixed race women. They jokingly call themselves Friends of the Mulatta Nation, and she reaches out to Black or biracial women writers. She eventually spends some time living in Ghana. Jaya John finally meets other men of color when he goes to college in Portland, Oregon, and seeks out other Black communities later. Rebecca Carroll has known her white birth mother for years, but counteracts the white community she's grown up in by choosing Black women writers as a specialty in her literary career. Susan Devon Harness interviews and surveys other Native American or mixed adoptees and is given a ritual welcome by her tribe as her memoir is about to be published. Jane Jung Trenka has been in long distance electronic contact with her birth mother for years when, upon college graduation, she finally goes on a group tour to Korea and meets her mother in person. After she hears her mother's stories translated by many different people, she finally feels transformed into her mother's daughter. A few years later, her mother dies, and she feels this makes them closer. At the very end, she imagines flying like a butterfly with her mother and her imagined daughter. Like Trenka, many memoirs conclude with an emphasis on the family that they have formed or hope to form. Mei-Ling Hopgood thinks of all the strands of family and all their travels that have contributed to making her young daughter. Katie Robinson thinks about continuing the mother-daughter relationship in the future, and Jenny Hadrian Wills ends her memoir with a letter to her baby daughter and quotes a Korean proverb, "The daughter follows the path of the mother." Jaya John ends with a ceremony celebrating his daughter's birth and baptism. A.M. Holmes concludes, describing her infant daughter as truly a blend of all four family lines, my greatest gift. Lori Jaquila, who throughout her memoirs discussed her children much more than most memoirists, thinks of her daughter's birthday collection at the end of the text proper, then adds an epilogue which concludes by evoking her parents' graves in the troubled steel town of Braddock where she grew up. Some other memoirists, John and McKinley in particular, near the end point to what they have gained from their adoptive parents in spite of their racial contrast. John writes, "I was Dad's son with his same irreverence for conformity. I was Mom's child with her willingness to sacrifice comfort in order to nurture and protect what she believed in." McKinley writes, "My parents gave me the tools to go forth and figure out an American Black woman's life." And yet there is another form of connection that strikes some adoptees with archives. I have found only same-race adoptees mentioning it, perhaps because so many archives exclude people of color. Harding is especially fascinated by stories of Irish immigration that contextualize his birth mother's history. Strauss finds ancestors in many generations past, including 4 Mayflower passengers and 2 medieval rulers. She adds her adoptive family to the tree she's built her memoir around and concludes, "I'm related to everybody." And Holmes, as she reads through genealogical archives, realizes a connection she shares with other archive searchers. The quest to answer the question, "Who am I?" is not unique to the adoptee. All these connections result from the adoptee's agency. They may have had traumas of growing up in racial or other kinds of isolation, of experiencing prejudice and loss, but they actively move toward other people and sometimes other people's histories. The story I tell here is one I identify with, although I had fewer struggles than most of these memoirists. I was not visibly adopted since my father also had dark hair, and we had moved away from the house to which I had suddenly arrived. As a white child of white parents, I was not the target of prejudice. On the other hand, I was a bookish only child, uncomfortable with the fact that I was not supposed to tell people I was adopted, telling even when I was in college only a few. But eventually I moved into something like the white version of what Sarah Idzik will call a commonography. I remember how important it was to me around 1973, in that time of abortion rights controversy, which has recently returned, when I saw personal ads saying something like, "Feminist adoptee seeks others for correspondence," and responded. After I moved to Pittsburgh for my job, I made a friend who was an adoptee and another brought up by foster parents who had reconnected with his birth mother. I remember hearing Betty Jean Lifton talk in 1975, corresponding with her, also connecting with Jean Payton. I joined a group called Pittsburgh Adoption Lifeline and attended conferences of the American Adoption Congress, Adoption Network Cleveland, and many other groups. And I got my original birth certificate and met my birth mother, who was glad to see me. We had little in common except 1 month together after birth and 9 months before, invisible links of heredity and a desire to maintain our relationship, which we did across the miles between Pittsburgh and rural Wisconsin, across our differences in religion, politics, and education until she died at 91. After her marriage, she had 7 sons, and I am still in touch with some of them, as well as her niece, my cousin, also a reconnected birth mother. Adoption has not been the only source of connections in my life. I had therapists. I taught English at the University of Pittsburgh, supported the Women's Studies program from its beginning. I joined churches and social justice organizations. I got married, and we have a daughter, now an adult and a mother herself. But adoption continued to be important as I developed and taught new courses on adoption and literature, including memoirs, and co founded an organization, the Alliance for the Study of Adoption and Culture, helped plan its first conferences, and edited a newsletter which has turned into a twice yearly journal. And after my birth father, who didn't want to meet me, died in 91 a few years ago, I connected with his son, another half brother.
Great. Thank you so much, Marianne. Sarah, I think, is going to go next. Thank you.
Thanks. Just 1 second while I do. Oh, screen sharing is not turned on. Is there a way to, oh, thank you very much. Oops, sorry. Oh my goodness. What a day. There we go. Okay. So the title for this, A Commonography of Souls, an overview of Asian adoptee rhetoric. The concept of a commonography of souls does come actually from Jane John Trenka, who Marianne quoted from and talked about in her presentation. I say that because I did cut a lot of content for this presentation. This is adapted from a dissertation chapter, so it's possible that may not have made it in there. So, all right. The walls of an orphanage, my mother's womb. Concrete slabs quiver and quake, spit me into the world. Legal papers and airplane tickets, preparation for my birth. 2 white people decide to adopt. That's where life began. In 1997, Tanya Bischoff and Joe Rankin published an edited volume of writings by Korean adoptees titled Seeds from a Silent Tree, an anthology of Korean adoptees. The first publication about an adoption, edited by adult adoptees, it marked an important moment in transnational adoptee cultural history. It was the first book in which Korean adoptees spoke entirely for themselves. In 45 essays and poems, adoptees wrote of loss, alienation, racism, reunions, and suicide. This excerpt from a poem titled Behind My Eyes by Melissa Lynn Hansen expressed a theme that's repeated in adoptee literature: the recognition that in the eyes of one's adoptive parents, of one's adoptive country, of the West, an adoptee's life begins when, as Bischoff writes, one is squeezed through the opening of a powerful steel bird. Oops, thought I had a quote there, but I don't. This image of perverse birth, in which the adoptee is born not of a person, not in a geographically or culturally specific place, but from an airplane, emphasizes the layers of an adoptee's reckoning with the concept of origins, an acknowledgement both of their lack of knowledge about their biological births and of their adoptive families and culture's disinterest in the same. The irony undercutting these birth images demonstrates that there's something dissonant and unnatural and even harmful about Western adoptive families' assumptions that their adopted child's life up to the point of disembarking from the airplane is unimportant and inconsequential. This imagery, recurring in Asian adoptee rhetoric, is a potent example of what Bell Hooks called talking back, defiant speech, speech that dares to disagree, that dares to speak as an equal to an authority figure. Critical adoption scholars have noted that adoptees are burdened with expectations of gratitude and indebtedness for having been, quote, rescued by their adoptive parents and given better opportunities in the US. Kimberly McKee has explained that the social pressure to present an affect of gratitude and joy maintains an adoptee status as what she calls the happy, grateful adoptee, whereas failure to effectively perform this gratitude results in being characterized as an ungrateful adoptee, angry and embittered. McKee coins the term adoptee killjoy, adapted from Sarah Ahmed's concept of the feminist killjoy, to describe an adoptee who disrupts adoption narratives of child rescue through political activism. The adoptee killjoy invites accusations of ingratitude and betrayal, but increasingly, adult adoptees have taken on this role. This paper examines Asian adoptee rhetoric, looking at cultural production by adult Asian American adoptees who, since about the 1990s, have engaged in refusal, not only declining to perform gratitude, but actively choosing to talk back to dominant discourse in very public ways. As a rhetorical phenomenon, adoptee discourse functions as a critique of domination, an important counterpoint to mainstream discourse around transnational adoption. The many layers of identity, kinship, and alienation expressed in adoptee writings inject complexity and ambivalence missing from paternalist narratives of adoption and complicate what's otherwise a simplistic picture of adoption, and affirming the production of group and community solidarity. Adoptee rhetorics also represent an important critique of the process of stranger adoption itself, exposing the abuses, manipulations, deceptions, and harms that have so often been perpetrated and permitted by adoption facilitators. In what follows, I ask what public examples of the adoptee killjoy have in common? What do they unearth about the unique and incommensurable experience of being the object of foreign stranger adoption from Asia to North America? And how do they function as a way not just of rewriting an Asian American diasporic experience, but of creating a unique Asian American diasporic identity? Through adoptee discourse, oh, this is the adoptee killjoy. My apologies. Through adoptee discourse, we see that adoptees' acts of naming the challenges they face, in describing their experiences, in finding a vocabulary individually and in common to begin to express feelings that quite literally have no place in the social world, is a political act. These acts directly confront the fact that in US public life, adoptee feelings and experiences that do not align with dominant discourses are insensible. As in, there is no established place for adoptee counter discourses, no genre, no space in social life for such expressions to inhabit, be accepted, and be understood. We also see what Lisa A. Flores has called a rhetoric of difference, or a rhetoric that repudiates mainstream discourse and crucially works to define group identity, allowing marginalized groups, through reflection on the uniqueness of their identity, to find security and a sense of home within. Adoptee discourse works to build a common language, vocabulary, and commonality of experience that slowly begins a process of affirmation, the intentional and deliberate creation of a community identity and the painstaking binding together of a diasporic people into a community that is neither fully Asian, nor fully American, nor fully Asian American in its shared experience. It is instead, as adoptee Jane Jung Trenka writes in her memoir, Fugitive Visions, a commonography of souls. This community identity is characterized and defined by loss, incommensurability, and non-belonging. It is also one whose membership grapples with the importance of biology, essentialism, and origins. This paper engages with publicly oriented works, focusing on writings that attempt to, in some way, reorient public opinion about adoption. I contend that the common themes that emerge through adoption narratives And I list them here. This includes acknowledgement of shared erased histories and attempts to validate and reclaim them, feelings of deformity, monstrosity, and alienness, the role that adoptive family and loved ones play in perpetuating harms through racist stereotypes or disregard for the importance of racial difference, the coming out of the fog journey, returns to Korea and birth families, and the subsequent realizations that one has to forge one's own sense of belonging, work as foundational themes for establishing a shared history on which to build a common identity. These themes begin to develop a commonography of souls. Due to time, in this presentation, I'm going to focus just on the first theme listed here, erased histories and attempts by adoptees to reclaim and validate them, as well as the relationship between these histories and adoptee racialized otherness. My name is Jung Kyung-ah. My family register states the date of my birth, the lunar date, January 24th, 1972. Halfway around the world, I am someone else. I am Jane Marie Brower, created September 26, 1972, when I was carried off an airplane onto American soil. In this excerpt, writer and adoptee Jane Jong Trenka juxtaposes her Korean existence with her American one, positing not only that she contains two distinct identities, but that her American one was artificially made. She was created, not born, on September 26, 1972, the day she arrived in the United States and was given to her adoptive family. Like the words of Melissa Lynn Hansen and Tanya Bischoff that open this paper, who also claim an unnatural and artificial beginning to their American lives, Trenka treats her American identity with irony, an imposition by her new family and new country that obliterated the identity, namesake, family, and history into which she was originally born. It is not so much that adoptees describe these beginnings where they are created or not born because they believe this to be the truth, but these descriptions represent what is, for all intents and purposes, the reality for them, because it is the hard and fast reality to their families and to all of those in their lives. Because of the sundering of their past histories upon adoption and arrival of in their adoptive countries, adoptees feel that whoever they may have been before their adoptions and who they became upon arrival in the US are mutually exclusive identities. For example, in a recreation of a childhood family scene, Trenka imagines her sister Carol as willing herself to, quote, become a girl with no history who is now ready to start her new life. The practice of stranger adoption that developed in transnational adoption practice, beginning with Korean War orphans, intentionally sundered all ties and contact from the adoptee's birth family with the act of their adoption. And accordingly, Trenka describes her and her sister's Korean selves as ghosts of our own dead twins, whom we had simply replaced one day by changing clothes. Kyung-ah, who lived to the age of 6 months, and Mija, who died at 4 years of age when she became Carol. Yet the effects of this death are not complete for adoptees who write of their experiences. Perhaps as a function of their being artificial creations, adoptees understand their American identities as in some ways false or inauthentic. When did I stop being Suna? Writes adoptee Suna. I was created, molded into Sonia. Later, she writes that her name was taken away and that her parents want to believe that my life began, that I was born in North America from a plane's exit door, a painful admission of their unwillingness to see me whole. Her false birth has led to her being forced to take on a false identity, one that requires suppression of her memories of Korea and any recognition of her past for the sake of her adoptive parents' acceptance. Suna has memories of Korea from her early childhood before her adoption, but she writes that her adoptive parents refused to listen to me and denied parts of my memory, which led her to question the veracity of her memory and her own past. The complicity of adoptive family members in this erasure of history is well documented in adoptee writings. Jenny Hyjin Wills, a Korean adoptee adopted to a family in Canada, writes in her memoir, Older Sister Not Necessarily Related, of attempting to teach her mother to pronounce her Korean name once she herself had learned it. Years later, we practiced saying it together. The rising first syllable, the dreamy second, blurred together like a sigh. Her voice became more frustrated each time. We were told your name was pronounced differently from what you're saying. She's consistent with that memory that dismisses my knowledge of my own name, my Korean family members' voices as they say it. I don't remember who was the first to give up trying, my Canadian mother or me. In adoptee discourse, original birth names hold an important place. They're a hallmark of adoptees' histories, things that tie them to the past and that they're now attempting to reclaim. And as a side note, many adoptees know very little about their past beyond their birth names, which I'm sure many of you know, which may not even be the names they were given by their birth parents, but rather names bestowed on them by other caregivers or the adoption agency. Wills writes that when she finally revisited Korea and found her Korean family, she was reborn somewhere in the dusky November mountains of Seoul when my youngest sister called me Uni, older sister, and I understood what that meant. Names are crucial signifiers of what has been taken from adoptees: loss of origin, loss of mother tongue, loss of being, as Leah Seek writes, leaving them a motherless, fatherless, peopleless dust. So, for Will's adoptive mother to first insist on her own knowledge of her daughter's incorrect Korean name over Will's knowledge, and then to give up learning this small yet essential piece of Will's identity entirely, is an indictment of her family's investment in denying and disavowing her past. Trenka depicts a household in which her and her sister's past are so buried and denied as to be forgotten even by themselves. Trenka and her sister Carol grew up never speaking about Korea to each other, although they were biological sisters who had been adopted together. She writes, "We wove a gag over our mouths as thick and impenetrable as love." This intentional forgetting, in which adoptees are completely cut off from their past at the moment of adoption and subsequently denied the validity of any memory or mention of that past, is a key feature of adoptees' assimilation and Americanization, which privileges integration into the white Western nuclear family and fails to address the needs or desire of the adopted child. This forgetting is, for adoption scholars, a key part in normalizing adoptive families. And to forget adoption, the most visible sign of difference between parents and children, race, had to be overlooked. Children were simply subsumed into the private space of the American home under the tutelage of white parents and left few options outside of assimilation. In other words, adoptive families' denials of the past do not only occur around adoptees' birth families and interest in their birth countries and cultures, they also encompass the recognition of adoptees' racial differences and the impact this has on their experiences living in majority white communities. And the racism Asian American adoptees experience, not to put too fine a point on it, is pervasive, rampant, and extremely well documented. Almost every adoptee writes of having been called a chink. Multiple adoptees write of having to explain or defend the allegedly Korean practice of eating dogs. Many describe their mortification and horror at being mocked by other children, pulling the corners of their eyes to give their eyes the slanted, narrower appearance of Asian eyes. Asian adoptees are frequently isolated as the only people of color or only Asians in their communities. And because they're usually the only people of color in their families, their experience is an especially isolated one. They're minorities in their own families, right? Adoptees routinely express that their adoptive families were ill-equipped to manage racial difference and unhelpful when racism became a problem for their non-white child. Suna writes that she struggles having grown up in a white family whose members deny their white privilege by denying the existence of white supremacy and instead tell me that racist people are ignorant and that I should ignore them, superior in my silence. In adoptee writings, adoptive parents are shown to have inadequate and shallow responses to racism that fail to consider the consequences for their child of growing up visibly non-white in a white family and community. And adoptees express a recurring recognition of the conflict between the significant role of race in their daily life and experience and the purported unimportance of race to their friends and loved ones. The deprivation of history that these transnational adoptees experiences is therefore a deprivation not only of birth families, but of adoptees' Asianness itself, their physical difference, and all the consequences that entails when living among predominantly white North Americans. Further, living in entirely or predominantly white areas with white families, adoptees express that they commonly saw themselves as white, or at least culturally, and just as often that they wanted to be white. Yet the recurring reminders that they were racial minorities led to repeated distress, confusion, and self-loathing around their racial identities growing up. Adoptees routinely describe effectively forgetting their own racial difference, much as their families have conditioned them to do, and are therefore shocked with a sense of betrayal by their own bodies when confronted with racial prejudice. Adoptees also write of experiencing a type of dissociation around their race and even racial bias against Asian Americans. An adoptee named Young Hee wrote that she used to believe I was white. At least I was completely emotionally invested in this belief. Theoretically, I was white. My family is white. The community I grew up in was white, and I could not point out Korea on a map, nor did I care about such a place. The only thing I heard about Korea was that they ate dogs. I denied that I was Korean to everyone, and most painfully, I denied it to myself. However, my image staring back at me in the mirror betrayed such a belief. There I saw it, the rude and awful truth. Slanted hooded eyes, non-existent eyelashes, yellow skin, short legs, and long torso. I hated myself, this betrayal, being given such a look without any knowledge of where it came from. In other words, adoptees acknowledge feeling throughout large portions of their lives that their inner whiteness is betrayed by their undesirable Asian outward features, which draw negative and unwanted attention in the form of racist comments and stereotypes, to the point that very frequently adoptees did not want to associate themselves with Asianness. As Wu reminds us, Korean adoptees were scattered and isolated in white US neighborhoods and towns, separated from other Asian communities, left without knowledge there are others like them. And thus, we see in adoptee writings, this leads to an abiding and overriding sense of isolation and loneliness. Thomas Park Clement had been in the US for more than 40 years before he thought to search the internet for other Korean adoptees and made his first connection to another adoptee. He writes of the intrinsic and deep-seated loneliness or sadness that dwells in him that was soothed, at least in part, on meeting another adoptee. But there is something missing way deep down inside of me. It's like there's tangible, unfinished business, a sadness in my heart. Other adoptees describe this sadness in the heart as an inability to feel whole, to properly inhabit or rectify both selves or two selves. Bruning writes of being divided and unable to feel whole. I could not find a way, did not know how to integrate my false self in acting and being white like my white adoptive parents and their 3 children, and my true self in feeling Asian or Korean into one complete whole self. The pervasive feelings of loneliness and non-belonging and the consequent inability to feel whole or complete are powerful, and they're shared. And they're common enough that adoptees are actually overrepresented in psychiatric hospitals, addiction programs, and therapy, with many reporting a persistent sense that they don't exist or aren't real or aren't human, that they weren't born from a woman but came from nowhere or from space. As a side note, a whole section of this paper that didn't make it into this presentation examines recurring themes of adoptees describing themselves as monstrous or deformed, as aliens. Those words are used repeatedly in these adoptee literatures. In a 2023 article in The New Yorker about the emotional aftermath of adoption, a Korean adoptee named Joy Lieberthal, who now has a private therapy practice for adoptees and adoptive parents, says, there were some international adoptees who said, my life began at JFK. Even if you know cognitively that's not true, no one can prove to you that it's not true. Matthew Solis is an adoptee who in 2023 wrote a piece for Time called How I Found My Desire to Live After My Wife Dies, identifies a central crux to transnational, transracial adoptees' feelings of not being whole. Being American, he says, is talked about to Asian Americans as a state of conversion where conversion indexes white. Quote, as if there's only one condition in which American is possible. To want conversion is to want a life in which multiple lives cannot exist. Because multiple lives could not exist if I were to be a good adoptee/convert, I wanted death, end quote. The anatomy of adoptee experience that's yielded by analysis of adoptee writings that span across authors, time, contexts, and media demonstrates that while adoptee identity is shifting, complex, and unstable, adoptee experience, as articulated by adoptees themselves, encompasses recurring themes that highlight the consistent detrimental effects that dominant discourses have had on adoptees as uniquely positioned minorities who are widely believed to have been rescued. The themes that emerged through analysis of adoptee discourse demonstrate a direct response from adoptees to the cultural, social, and political conditions that dominant discourses have circumscribed for them, and the limited capacity that all people, adoptees, family, friends, and non-relations alike, have therefore developed to adequately manage the complexities of the adoption process. These characteristics are not exhaustive by any means, but this study of adoptee writings builds a compelling model of the rhetorical resources used by adoptees to both respond to structuring pressures and to create their own identities and communities, which helps us better understand what it means to construct identities in difference outside of normative models of cultural diversity. Through their cultural production, adoptees do not only take on the role of McKee's adoptee killjoy, publicly refusing to perform gratitude and countering the expectations of feeling and behavior placed upon them, They also dare to imagine what it means to create a fledgling, fragile, but very real community based on the radical premise of non-belonging. Word by word, year after year, they chart their own commonography of souls. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to share my screen now. Oop. Okay. All right, can you all see the slideshow? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can? Thank you so much. Okay. Well, thank you both for those two really wonderful papers. I'm so glad to be sharing this space with you. And I will continue, I think, many of the threads that you both have activated for us in today's conversation. And I also want to note that I'll also, as an adoptee, I will be following these two really adoptee focused papers. Okay. As of December 7th, 2022, South Korea has begun a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate its history of transnational adoption during Korea's period of authoritarian rule. Put in motion by the Danish Korean Rights Group, DKRG, on behalf of Korean adoptees across the world, this event is a momentous one, representing the first full-scale investigation of possible human rights violations regarding adoptions from Korea. That Korea has accepted the commission is particularly meaningful as a country that has sent an astonishing 200,000 of its children abroad since the nominal end of the Korean War in 1953, and in doing so, set an important precedent for transnational adoption as an option for modern family making. So there are many things to say about this commission, which is set to deliver its findings in spring 2026. But what I find in 2025, sorry. But what I find especially interesting is how adoption records have emerged as particularly contested objects in this legal discourse, not only as evidence of human rights abuses, but also as vehicles of imagined repair. One of the DKRG's central demands is, quote, the full opening of original adoption documents, end quote, currently in the custody of major Korean adoption agencies, as well as the transfer, preservation, and protection of these documents by Korean post-adoption authorities. The opening and proper handling of documents is crucial to guaranteeing adoptee human rights, particularly the right to one's identity, personhood, and development of personality. But the importance of these documents also exceeds the language of the law. Their representations indexing both forms of textual violence, as well as deeply felt desires and attachments. So this complex surfacing and privileging of paperwork is the starting point of this talk. Why are these documents worth fighting for? What makes them crucial for guaranteeing human rights and establishing something like truth and reconciliation for the international adoption community, as well as perhaps for South Korea? And what do they mean to the adoptees they represent, especially if that representation is ambiguous, erroneous, or fabricated? This last question in particular bears further study. For many adoptees, awareness of their adoption often begins in relation to these records, which raise questions about their origins and the account of how they came to be adopted. Think of Sarah's paper and her discussion of the perverse birth of adoptees. Others may have never seen their archive, whether it was discarded or denied to them by their adoptive parents, or whether their adoption was undocumented in various degrees. Though most adoptees know about the existence of their archive, they relate to it in different ways. Some may decide to not look into it. Some may have seen it years before and set it aside. Others may focus on particular details that become key to their sense of identity. Others still may have to cope with its lack or absence. Hunger, fear, anxiety, compartmentalization, archival disorientation is a crucial part of adoptee epistemology, or to use Jae-Ran Kim's words from earlier this morning, critical adoptee consciousness. Archives are a site of uncertain knowledge that many of us reckon with at some point in our lives, one that brings us in critical relation to the systems and infrastructures that made us adoptees. But even in cases when records are unsealed or opened for their subjects, these documents pose numerous interpretive difficulties. These may hinge on their specific vocabularies, their opaque formulas, convenient fabrications, or perhaps most often, their frustrating silences. Adoption archives thus raise fundamental questions about the very act of reading, or indeed what it means to read for adoption at all. Above all, I'm interested in the representational, even existential dilemma posed by adoption archives. That is, that adoptees are made through paperwork, and yet, of course, they exceed it. We have been made objects through archives in some way, denied individuality and the singularity of each human life. And yet this observation is also accompanied by the impulse to say that adoptees are more than their paperwork, that this paperwork doesn't define who we are, especially given its limitations. So what does it mean then to take both of these claims seriously, that adoptees are made by paperwork, but also exceed it? I'd like to dwell in this space of contradiction rather than resolve it too quickly today, as a means of bringing matters of representation to the forefront of critical analysis. In this spirit, my talk offers the following provocation: that these archives matter not just as a source of violence or recovery, or as an unrecoverable origin, but rather as textual forms that have deep implications for legal and cultural representations of transnational adoption. Though the works I'll discuss all agree and even insist that adoptees far exceed their paperwork, some of their most powerful critiques and reimaginings of adoption come in the invocation and reworking of the archive. Adoptees' relationship to their paperwork thus offers a critical index of this loss and all it entails, reflecting key dynamics of power, subjecthood, and desire. A more perfect justice for adoptees, then, requires a deeper understanding of adoption archives and their representational stakes. So part one, what is an adoption archive? Before moving on, I want to address what I mean by adoption archive in this paper. And by this, I don't mean existing institutional archives that contain materials related to adoption from local, national, and international organizations. While these institutional archives have been really important, particularly in critical adoption studies and scholarly work, my focus in this talk is on what we might call personal adoption archives, those materials and case files that accompany the adoptee during their adoption. Additionally, while paperwork mediates the experience of adoption for all involved, including birth families, adoptive families, and social workers, this paper focuses on the particular relationships that adoptees have with their archive and the complex negotiations of self and identity that arise from them. I think there's a certain dependency that adoptees have on their paperwork that I'm focusing on here. So adoption archives vary widely depending on the agencies involved, year of adoption, family circumstances, and other factors. In the case of Korean adoption, these records might include case numbers, referral photographs, social histories, health reports, travel certificates, and legal records. These records also include documents from the adoptee's adoptive country, such as applications and interviews and home studies, resident alien cards, birth certificates, and certificates of citizenship if adoptive parents took the steps to document and naturalize their adopted child. Yet, as many adoptees discover, there are often other documents in their dossiers that don't make it into the hands of their adoptive families. Again, to take the case of Korean adoption, there is often Korean language documentation used by Korean social workers in the state, double archives, often containing more detailed information about the adoptee, whether about their health, behavior, or social histories. And it is indeed in these Korean language versions that adoptees sometimes discover the existence of their birth parents, contradicting the assertion from other records that their birth parents were unknown or that they were an orphan. So, as you can tell, I think the form of these adoption documents often raises more questions than answers. Many adoptees discover the formulaic nature of these narratives, especially in the case of Korean adoption, the history of birth and admission, which tells the story of how we came to be abandoned by our birth parents. Others may find their birth date to be a fabrication, a date assigned to many other adoptees processed through their agency. Still others may discover their paperwork is not theirs, but rather another child's whom they have happened to replace, a situation featured in Deanne Bourché-Liem's documentaries first person plural, and in the matter of Cha Jung-hee. As Kimberly McKee has noted, many reports rely on a formulaic template to express adoptees' supposedly unique stories, objectifying them in a way that highlights the malleable, even fungible nature of adoptee identity. So how then do we read these documents? One, I think, incredibly justifiable response to these documents is not to read them at all, or at least to remain deeply skeptical about them. And I do think there might even be radical or even liberatory potential in not investing so much in the archive and its haphazard significations. But for now, I'm interested in what it means to read these documents along the grain, taking seriously knowledge from archival sources while also maintaining a critical or resistant stance to the power regimes that created them. As scholars such as Anne-Laura Stoller, Marissa J. Fuentes, and Durban Mitra have shown, attending to the patterns, categories, structures, and classifications in the archive provide a way of apprehending minoritized persons, even in their repression, regulation, and subjectification. So to read these documents along the grain means to contend with the idea of the template, asking what kinds of knowledge it indexes as well as the silence it contains. We might, like Robin McDowell, wonder about these records' markers of personality, such as clean and genial, that was her description, or calm and mild-tempered, that was mine. These descriptors raise questions about what kinds of subjects are being invoked by these documents. And I will say, I am no longer calm and mild-tempered. These descriptors raise questions about what kinds of subjects are being invoked by these documents. How do these assurances of agreeability, docility, and physical containment shape expectations about adoptees' behavior in their new adoptive family? How, if at all, do they deepen existing racial and gendered stereotypes about Asian girls and women? And what kind of disciplinary effect, even contract, do they promise? If adoptees are made through paperwork, that relationship is more than a legal act, registering a change of familial status. Instead, these documents reflect the potential of adoption archives to have marked effect on subsequent subject formation. The question then is how we understand this relationship and how, if at all, adoption archives determine the connections between paper and persons. Okay, so part 2 is archive fever in literature. I'm a literature professor, and I think it's a really exciting time to be thinking about adoption and its representations in literature and culture, as more and more artists, especially adoptees themselves, are producing such wonderful and provocative work that is helping rethink the stories that get told about adoption. Indeed, opening up space for new narrative possibilities that we need, live, and have even yet to imagine. And I think both papers speak really well to this kind of new flourishing and even renaissance of adoption literatures. Notably, I think reckoning with these with adoption archives is actually a very central part of many of these recent cultural texts and their genres, including, and I'll just give you a taster here, the coming of age narrative. I'm moving by genre here now, in which documents either open up new forms of maturation and self-discovery for the young main character, or equally, if not more the case, prove to be dead ends or impasses in their development arc. And I'm thinking here of the recent art film Return to Seoul, the picture here, where the main character, Freddie, is in an adoption agency modeled off of Holt. This movie moves and fits and starts with each return. Related to this genre is, of course, the memoir, which Marianne spoke about, including Jane Jong Trenka's The Language of Blood, which sees Jane's attempts to secure her file from Lutheran Social Services fail. And Sarah also spoke about this really important memoir. Another genre that features documentation is the detective plot, in which documents become objects of almost forensic interest as adoptees try to piece together the mysteries of their origins. I'm thinking here of Lisa Ulrim Hueblum's graphic memoir Palimpsest and Deanne Borsche-Liam's documentary In the Matter of Cha Jung-hee, in which the absences and misleading information of the archive drive the plot forward, creating a hunger for the truth that is only ever partially fulfilled. Relatedly, there's the legal drama, such as the penultimate scene of Han Sol-jung's Wolf play, pictured here, whose custody battle of a Korean adoptee centers on the viability of a power of attorney document. Again, and I think you can sense a pattern here, the power of these documents is only ever partial. Indeed, in Wolf Play, the courtroom scene ends with the adoptee wolf declining to give testimony on his behalf, a critical refusal to participate in the ongoing creation of his own adoption archive. So that's one place where maybe opting out of the archive is a form of power. And finally, and I think most interestingly in a way, there's dystopian literature, which takes the idea of adoption archives and really just runs with it. I'm thinking here of the comic series Made in Korea, which turns on the development of a novel code that allows a robot proxy child exceptional emotional development. That's pictured here. Or we might think of Alexander Weinstein's short story After Yang, whose plot kicks off when an adoptee's robot companion and cultural supplement, that is, another archive, breaks down and can't be repaired due to an expired warranty. So taken together, these works show that archives are a constituent element of cultural production around transnational adoption. We might say that adoption literatures are infected with what theorist Jacques Derrida calls archive fever, and he describes it here. It is to burn with a passion. It is never to rest interminably from searching for the archive right where it slips away. It is to run after the archive, even if there's too much of it, right where something in it and archives itself. It is to have a compulsive, repetitive, and nostalgic desire for the archive, an irrepressible desire to return to the origin, a homesickness, a nostalgia for the return to the most archaic place of absolute commencement. So this description of archive fever resonates really with structures of adoption, especially for adoptees. Think, for instance, of the connotations of doing a birth search or being in search and reunion, not to mention the logic of returning to one's origins. And indeed, when I presented this at ASAC, the Alliance for the Study of Adoption and Culture, like lots of people laughed when I read this because it felt so appropriate to the adoption journey and what it means to search for origins. Adoption archives do indeed produce this archive fever, the desire to find oneself documented, especially if the only evidence of your previous life comes to you as partial, mediated, or not at all. And yet the orientation to adoption archives in these literary texts critically exceeds Derrida's melancholic and nostalgic diagnosis. On the one hand, there's a really practical side to adoption archives, insofar as they contain the possibility of reuniting with real, live people or learning more about one's medical history. As many adoptees have noted, these archives are accompanied by the sense of a ticking clock over one's head, as the people who may have witnessed our adoption continue to age and threaten to disappear forever. Neither in these literatures are archives a source of justice or even restoration, instead emerging as complicated and even contradictory forms of knowledge and recovery. They are primarily a source of frustration, of unreadability, of further mystification, or excess that cannot be assimilated. Indeed, we might say that the unreadability of the archive leads to a kind of critical play with the archive itself, with its forms, its malleability, its expectations, its materiality, in order to remediate archival fragments and their silences into meaningful forms of creative expression. Finally, these literatures show that adoption archives aren't the only referent. They're not even the main referent. Instead, other archival sites emerge as crucial to adoptees' self-knowledge and subject formation, whether cultural artifacts or the body as a carrier of memory. Perhaps after chasing the state in this manner, adoptees need to conduct their own exchanges and substitutions, bypassing state archives to embrace the biological or the cultural. So part 3 is going to be a reading of the particular work, Palimpsest. So in the time that remains, I'm going to focus on one text in particular, one that I think is the fullest literary engagement with adoption archives, and one that I hold in the highest esteem, the 2016 graphic memoir, Palimpsest, by Swedish-Korean adoptee Lisa Urum Sjöblom. Sjöblom's work is particularly notable, I find, due to the claims she makes between the experience of adoption and the practices of writing. And perhaps the most evident claim comes from her title, Palimpsest, as underscored in her epigraph here. Palimpsest, a very old text or document in which writing has been removed and covered or replaced by new writing. Adoption, the act of legally taking a child to be taken care of as your own. As its subtitle, Documents from a Korean Adoption, suggests, this is really a story about paperwork, what's hidden, destroyed, forged, casual mistakes and clerical errors. Lisa's search for her first family becomes a complex, befuddling paper chase where access is never guaranteed and where much depends on who is doing the requesting, who is on the receiving end, and even, in one startling moment, which side of the paper is scanned and sent. Now, reviewers of Hui Bloom's work have puzzled over just how much text she provides, a quality that one reviewer deemed tedious, as if there was too much script to work through. That reviewer is missing the point. Yes, Hui Bloom overwhelms the reader with documentation, envelopes, emails, websites, and files that are minute, extensive, exhaustive, reiterative. But she does so to let the reader experience the host of feelings that accompany adoption archives. Fevered desire, yes, but also frustration, confusion, excitement, mistrust, and alienation. And in doing so, Palimpsest soundly condemns infrastructures of documentation for their misdirection, opacity, and outright lies. This critique is succinctly put in a panel listing what adoptees have been told about their documents, that they were lost, destroyed in a fire, by flood, natural disaster, or that they were thrown away. And yet, Palimpsest also plays with and repurposes archival forms, creating its own archival literature. Take, for instance, its coloration, its muted palette, echoing the red, blue, black, and tan of adoption documentation. One could imagine a version of this graphic novel with a completely different color scheme, maybe told in more vibrant colors to heighten contrast with the archive. But I think that wouldn't be as effective as the work's archival color tones, which, like the cover image, makes a powerful statement about the relationship between text and subject. And this is why the medium of the graphic novel is especially well suited for Hui Bloom's project. As Hui Bloom herself has said, comics mediate darker, more controversial histories in important ways. But more importantly, for an archival reading of this work, comics also call attention to the layers, textures, media, and occasions of reading. It calls more attention to these than the printed word or even the photograph. And so my last slide, and where I'll close today, will be to consider one such moment when Lisa receives a document from Korean Social Welfare Services, her Korean adoption agency. So this image, as you can see, is an amalgam of a photocopied document, the Korean file underneath, the reproduced image, the photograph of Lisa, turned into a comic, and speech bubbles that interrupt the text below. This layering critically reverses the adoptive palimpsest's underwriting and overwriting, asserting Hui Bloom's interpretation as important, if not more so, than the text that made her an adoptee. She is layered on top. Yet for all its deciphering, there's also a critical withholding here that I find fantastically powerful. Though this page chooses to incorporate a more realistic version of the Korean document, the photograph of her is rendered as an illustration. This is crucial. I read this medial transposition as a critical refusal to reproduce the state. That is, to do more than merely recount the violence that deposited traces of these subjects in the archive in the first place. While palimpsest might read as almost another adoption file, a manila folder, or case file one might happen upon in an archive, I take it instead as a counter-narrative to echo the theme of our conference today, and a word that Hui Bloom uses to describe her own work. And even more importantly than it's a counter-narrative, but it's also a counter-archive. For her graphic novelistic version represents the wished-for fulfillment of finding a thorough account of oneself in the archive, as you turn over the yellowing pages and realize that your labors of deciphering and piecing together have already been done for you. This, in the end, is the gift that palimpsest gives its readers, its own case file to pass on that, though still riddled with gaps and silences, shows the care and work of reintegrating the self. Thank you.
Would you guys like to take some questions now?